into the quarter. I'm going to try my best to teach through the rest of 1 Corinthians as if we were still in class. Couple of things before I get into 1 Corinthians chapter 10 where we left off. The first one being that I'm just filming this on the back porch. So if there happens to be like a helicopter flying over and that picks up on the audio, just live with it. They've been flying over all day. The second thing is just go through this video, however long it is, and fill in the rest of the blanks to the workbook, and we'll go from there. Don't worry about any class grade or anything at this point. Interesting circumstances call for interesting reactions. Unique circumstances call for unique reactions. The last time we were in class, we left off in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and we made it through 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11, which moves into the next section. The 12, 13, 14 is kind of transitory as it moves into the next section. And so we'll pick up there. I'm going to try to be as thorough. There are some really critical things in 1 Corinthians chapters 11 through 14, especially 1 Corinthians 11 and then 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and 14 that really need to be touched on, which is why I'm just going to go ahead and teach through the rest of this class. If it were some other book, I might say, like if it were Isaiah, which we'll take together third quarter, I might just say, hey, I'll be really brief and we're going to bypass the workbook and be a little more brief. But some of this is really critical to ministry. One of the issues in particular is the women issue, whether or not women should be allowed to be preachers. Radical feminism is pressing on us. So that becomes an issue. 1 Corinthians 11 is critical. 1 Corinthians 14 is critical on that issue. So we need to really cover those chapters at least. I'm just going to try to teach through the rest of 1 Corinthians. If you follow this video, you should be able to just go through the video, fill in the blanks to the worksheets, and we'll call it a quarter. With that in view, we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and we left off last time around 10:11. In light of the Old Testament, let me set up the context first. In chapter 8, he's dealing with the meats issue, but it's about using liberty. In chapter 9, he gives himself as an illustration and says, I had this liberty to be paid as a preacher, but he says I didn't use that. And he's made all the argumentation to say that he should use it, could use it. And so the fact that Paul doesn't use his liberty is suggesting to Corinth, these elites, he's saying to the elites, you don't have to use a liberty just because you have it. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he's back into that context again, but he sets up this Old Testament group, which is the Old Testament Israeli people. And he says, if they were God's people and they too could fall, then he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he says, then Corinth, you shouldn't be so high-minded. You too could fall, even being the people of God. You could use your liberty in such a way that actually is selfish, loveless, and even though you have a liberty, there's a bigger issue at stake, which is lovelessness or selfishness, and he's saying that could condemn you. So we need to be very careful, even if we have a liberty on something, to make sure that our attitude doesn't get carried away and we actually sin, as Paul said you could do in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Use this sin against Christ, against your brother, and that is the sin, not of eating meats, but it's the sin of lovelessness or selfishness. It's the sin of an ungodly attitude. So he reminds that even God's Old Testament people could engage in that sort of thing. And with that in view, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we turn to verse 12. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. Let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. Now, he's just given us the Old Testament illustration. He's insisting that one could fall possibly because of, number one, false pride. Number two, one could fall because of selfishness or isolationism. And number three, one could even fall because of others' actions. Now, that's striking, but that's what he's saying to Corinth. You could fall. If you were one of those elites at Corinth and you thought, well, I'm invulnerable, nothing can touch me, Paul actually says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 12, you can fall. Take heed that you do not fall. How might you fall? Possibly false pride, which was going on at Corinth. They thought themselves to be the elites. They thought themselves to be the strong party, which Paul never terms them. Number two, they could fall because of selfishness or isolationism. Let's create our own little clique in church work, and let's only pander to this certain crew. Let's be individualist. That could kill somebody spiritually. Or number three, one could fall because of others' actions. If you eat the meat in a loveless way, you could cause another person to fall. And so the weak in conscience need to be very aware of that as well. So in light of that, that you could fall, even if you're standing, you could fall because of your human pride. He says, 10:13, no temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. This could be Paul's reminder to them that even though you're in Corinth and you may be thinking, well, Paul, you don't understand what it's like to be in Corinth. You don't understand what it's like to be in Vegas. Paul could be saying to them, I actually do. But even so, God hasn't given any human a temptation that he's not able to overcome. The temptation that exists at Corinth is common to humanity. It's nothing extraordinary. It's the typical human condition, and they simply need to fight against it. So he says this on 10:13, God is faithful. Don't threaten God and say God doesn't get it. God is faithful to the human family, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but will with the temptation be able to provide a way of escape that you will be able to endure. And so in 10:14, here's sometimes there are certain problems that we can strategize and we can come up with a game plan regarding, but some problems you just got to avoid. And this is one. If it's the sexual problem, and it looks like that's probably what Paul has in mind, the sexual problem in connection with the idolatrous pagan temples. He says on 10:14, flee from idolatry. That's similar back in chapter 6 when he just simply says, 6:18 of 1 Corinthians, flee immorality. 1 Corinthians 6:18, flee immorality. Well, here he says, flee idolatry. It's the pagan, idol, sexual issue that he's dealing with. And he simply says on 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 14, flee. Sometimes we can strategize and sometimes we cannot. Sometimes we just need to be told, put the sin down. And that may be sharp, that may be hard, that may be difficult for us to do. But sometimes there's no game plan to come up with. We just need to flee. So you're blank on number 11 if you've got the workbook there, chapter 10. Paul's method of escape is simply to flee. Now, when you look at 10 and verse 15, he says, I speak as to wise men. You judge what I say. Well, that's their claim anyway. They've claimed to be wise. Does Paul think that these people are wise? I don't think so. Your blanks on number 12, Paul's note to wise men, is probably sarcastic. In other contexts, 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 10, he says something like this, we are fools for Christ's sake, but you are prudent in Christ. You've got it all figured out. You're the wise fellows. Oh, that's right, I forgot. You guys have it all mastered. He said something similar in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. He said, you're just simply mere mortals or mere men, 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 4. Or perhaps most striking and sharply, he says in 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 5, do you not have one wise man among you? You would have thought with all of this intelligence that Corinth had, they wouldn't have needed to take brethren to court. That's exactly what they were doing. They were invoking the civil courts to take brethren to take them to court to try to get some kind of verdict against brethren over something like $5, $10. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, when he says, I speak to wise men, he is not speaking factually or legitimately. That is a remark of sarcasm. I speak to wise men is a slur against them. It's tongue in cheek. Judge what I say. Now he says this. We need to follow this. This is 10 and verse 16. Is not the cup of blessing. This, by the way, listen to me. We're back here in 1 Corinthians 10:14 to the idolatrous issue. So it's not going to be shocking that when he comes up with meats offered to idols, that's the issue again. He's coming right back into the issue he started with, which is lovelessness as it's demonstrated in, and there are those helicopters. He's talking about lovelessness as it's demonstrated in the meats issue. In 1 Corinthians 10:16, he says, is not the cup of blessing which we bless a sharing in the blood of Christ? Is not the bread which we break a sharing in the body of Christ? Since there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Look at the nation of Israel, verse 18. Are not those who eat the sacrifices sharers in the altar? Verse 19. What do I mean then? That a thing sacrificed to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? I'm going to read through verse 22. Verse 20, no. But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to become sharers in demons. Verse 21, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Verse 22, or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? We're not stronger than he is, are we? Okay, let's go ahead and fill in this blank on number 13. Paul uses three examples. This is verse 16. He uses the cup and the bread of Christ. That's the Lord's Supper. The second illustration he uses is the Levitical altar. That's verse 18. He brings in the nation of Israel, those who share in the altar. So he uses the Lord's Supper, the Levitical altar, and then the third one he uses, verse 19, is the pagan offering or pagan worship, the pagan altar and the meal affiliated with it. In all three of these illustrations, Paul's making one point, and here's your blank. He is illustrating that the worshiper is associated with the worship. He is saying that the worshiper is associated with the worship, verses 16 through 19. That's the point he's homing in on. Now, there are a couple of things we should possibly observe off of 20 through 22. He basically says that you shouldn't be involved in the pagan practice. And he brings up this Old Testament echo probably of Deuteronomy 32. If you were making notes, make a note perhaps of Deuteronomy 32, verses 16, 17, and 21. That's a note off of the side of 10, verse 20. When he says, I do not want you to become sharers in demons, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Back in Deuteronomy 32, Israel, it says, had gone after demons. Deuteronomy 32, 16, 17, and verse 21. And if Paul is evoking Old Testament Israel, as the first part of this chapter would suggest, what he's saying then is that Corinth runs the risk of getting involved in idol pagan worship too, if they don't watch themselves. They can fall if they do not take heed. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 12. And so he's cautioning them that the worshiper is affiliated with the worship. So, to bring it back to context, if you go up to the pagan temple and you sit there and you eat the meat offered to idols, you have that liberty, Paul's already said. But you need to be very careful because it can be just a moment's notice and you've slipped right back into full-blown pagan worship. And if that happens, there's a difference. You don't have liberty to engage in the pagan worship and the pagan idolatrous practice, but you do have the liberty to be in the church building, the denominational church building, and you have the right to be there for a wedding or a funeral and to eat the meal that they've got. But it's only a fine line between doing that sort of thing and then engaging in full-blown denominational pagan worship. And I'm, of course, making this a little bit modern as I explain. Now, let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10 then and verse 22. Do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? We're not stronger than he are. You only have one master. That's what Jesus said, Matthew 6:24. You only have one master. Do you serve God or do you serve wealth or something else? Do you serve God or do you serve paganism? And so you need to go ahead and make your mind up, he says on 10:22. Do we provoke God to jealousy? We're not stronger than he, are we? The idea of being strong is their word. But Paul even says, we could engage in practices that would provoke God to jealousy if we get back in pagan practice. And Paul says, stay away from that. You came out of it. 1 Corinthians 12:2. You used to serve these dead idols. Stay out of it. If you go there, just be sure you're not getting involved in the practice. We're getting close at this point, and we're about to get into this, about the difference of practicing something versus being in proximity to it. And earlier in class, I had used the illustration of, if you're at the Kansas City Royals baseball game and alcohol is there, you may be in proximity to something, but you're not necessarily practicing it. You don't have to use alcohol even though you're in proximity to it. But be careful if you struggle with that sort of thing, or even if you don't, be careful that you don't become a practicer of those things. Be careful that you're not being a worshiper with the idols, the pagans. And that's what Paul's point is. You can be in proximity and not partake, But the moment you start partaking in the practice, there's a difference. You've crossed the line. Okay, let's take a look at 10:23. But let me give you these blanks here on number 14. Paul probably answers a Corinthian objection to his argument. They may have said that Paul's implying the reality of idols. So the number 14, he answers a Corinthian objection. Number 15, Paul has this: Old Testament Israel had sacrificed to demons, and Corinth could make that same mistake. You're blank on number 15. Israel had sacrificed to demons. And then you're blank on number 16. God's jealousy was actually for their good. When God is a jealous God, it is for our good. He's not doing this out of some kind of hatred. God's jealousy for us is actually for our good. Whatever God is, it is for the human family. He is for the human family. Okay, let's look at 23 through 30. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 23. All things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. Again, that's their slogan, that all things business. You look back at chapter 6 and verse 12, 1 Corinthians 6:12, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. 6:12 again, all things are lawful for me. But Paul responds and says, but I'll not be mastered by any. In 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 23, we see that slogan again. All things are lawful. And Paul counters back, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful. And Paul says, but not all things edify. So Paul says in 10:24, let no one seek his own good. Don't be selfishly seeking your own good. That's not our drive. That's not our motive. Seeking after only ourselves is not our drive, 10:24, but rather that of his neighbor. That's our primary focus. Sounds like Jesus, doesn't it? Love your neighbor as yourself. 10:25, eat anything. Listen to this. This is critical. 10:25, eat anything that's sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake. That is explicit. Paul says if you've got meat that's before you, don't ask questions. Your conscience won't be bothered. You don't ask where the meat came from. Just eat the meat for pity's sake. That's what he says in 10:25. Eat anything that's sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake. If it's going to bother your conscience, if you find out that this meat's been offered to idols, he says, then don't ask. 26. For the earth is the Lord and all it contains. The arguments about food. This belongs to God. Meat that's been offered to idols is still God's. Don't think that it now somehow transforms itself into some pagan's belonging. That's not the truth. It's still God's stuff. He's the creator of it. And he quotes Psalm 24:1 on that. Verse 27. If one of the unbelievers, the pagans, if one of the idolatrous invites you and you want to go, listen to this. This is 10:27. Eat anything that is set before you. Once again, he emphasizes, without asking questions for conscience sake. We'll come back to some of this, of course. 28. But if anyone says to you, this is meat sacrificed to idols, do not eat it for the sake of the one who informed you and for conscience sake. Now he's clear. 10:29 clears up. Who is he talking about on 10:28? I mean not your own conscience, but the other man's. For why is my freedom judged by another's conscience? He's talking then about us being concerned and aware of somebody else's conscience. That means that we've got to take thought. If this is going to bother our neighbor or our brother, we've got to take thought and say, yeah, I probably should not do this if it's going to harm the conscience and cause loss of life with Christ. So he says on 10:30, if I partake with thankfulness, why am I slandered concerning that for which I give thanks? So he says we've got to be aware and conscious of another man's conscience. But he says, but if I do go ahead and eat the meat, I have that right. I have that liberty. But I need to be aware and make sure that I'm doing it out of good motives and not out of some selfish, loveless attitude. You have the right, but you don't have the right to be loveless. You have the right to eat the meat offered to idols or other liberties, other Christian liberties, but you don't have the right to have a loveless, selfish attitude. Okay, let's go back through some of this. Number 17, Corinth's slogan a line that they applied to the sex issue and to the food issue equally. They look at food and sex as two things that you should be able to engage in with liberty, as if neither one's a problem. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 23, that slogan, Paul objects to and says this. These are your blanks on number 17. All things are not profitable, and your next blank is edifying. All things are not profitable. All things are not edifying. Paul is teaching Corinth to read Scripture beyond the explicit letter of the law. Instead, Christians should see the good of his, here's your next blank, neighbor first. Now think about this. There's not a passage where the Bible tells us, thou shalt not get tattoos. I know about the old law. Interestingly enough, the same text that says about the cuttings or the markings on skin, same passage that talks about not shaving the beard. Isn't that striking? Some of these Christians go to the Old Testament text and want to appeal to Leviticus about no tattoos. But it's interesting that the same passage, literally the very prior passage, right before the passage that says no cuttings or markings on the skin, is the same context. The passage just prior says no cutting of your beard. That is striking to me. I find it ironic that none of our brethren ever bring that passage up and try to use the old law, Leviticus, to say you shouldn't cut your beard. Interestingly enough, most of the same people who go to Leviticus to say that we shouldn't have tattoos are the same ones who say we must shave in preparation for Sunday morning. So there you have it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, all things are lawful, all things are not profitable. All things are lawful, not all things edify. Let everyone have this drive, seek the good of your neighbor. When we learn to read Scripture with a bigger hue, a bigger vision, a bigger picture, a bigger perspective, the Bible won't explicitly have to come out and say, Drew, think about if you could lose people's life with Christ, cost them their life with Christ by getting a tattoo. Could I somehow harm the kingdom of God by getting a tattoo? What about this one? The Bible doesn't have to come out and say, Drew, you need to like NASCAR. I have a liberty to despise NASCAR. I have that right. I have that liberty. If I don't like NASCAR, I don't like NASCAR. But what I don't have a right to be is loveless towards the people who do. In fact, I think there's a moral responsibility for us to take interest, not because of NASCAR, but to take interest in people. And we take interest in their things to show that we care beyond. And the Bible can't come out and give us an explicit word on all of that. Instead, 1 Corinthians chapter 9 comes back here. We are slave to all. 1 Corinthians 9:19. That is important. We become slave to all. Your interest of NASCAR, your despising of tattoos, these things ought to govern me. I am making myself, like Christ, a slave to humanity, willfully, voluntarily. And then there's 1 Corinthians 9:21. We're not without any law. We are under, as he calls it, this is a very cryptic remark. This is the law of Christ. He's not talking about the New Testament as far as a new legal pattern, folks. He is talking, when he says the law of Christ, he is talking about the very methodology of who Jesus was. He is saying that Jesus went the furthest degree to love and selflessly sacrifice for humanity. And if we take up that methodology, it's going to cause us to see there are more important things than my liberties. Eating meat offered to idols, having tattoos, disliking NASCAR, etc., etc., etc. When we learn to be like Christ and have the mind of Christ, we serve others more than ourselves. And that's because that's the big picture that God has for us as being human people. There's a harder drive here. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we ought to seek not only whether or not it's lawful. Well, I have this right. I have this liberty. I have this law. 1 Corinthians 10:23. But we ought to have, does it profit? Does it edify? Does it perform the good for my neighbor? We ought to have those things in mind. Okay, so your last blank on number 17, we ought to bear the infirmity. It says in Romans 15 that the saints should bear the infirmity, and it doesn't say bear with or put up with it. And you may say, well, what's the difference? What's the difference between bearing an infirmity and bearing with an infirmity? Here's the difference. I might tolerate your like of NASCAR, but bearing that is me actually taking up an interest in NASCAR. Me tolerating NASCAR would look like me saying, I know you like NASCAR, and I'm fine with that. But me bearing it would be me sitting there and taking interest in it. There's a difference. There's a difference. It's like I said earlier, Paul, if he were to bear the burden, he's not bearing with their burden. He is bearing their burden. If he were to bear the burden with the weak in conscience, he would come in, see the meat that had been offered to idols, and eat none of it. He wouldn't say a word. He wouldn't introduce himself by saying, no, Paul, no, I have this right. I could eat this meat. No, Paul would just simply go in there and look the part of the weak. He would bear that burden. Looking the part of the weak, you would think he didn't know any better. And he would just simply abstain from eating the meat offered to idols. He would look and take on the very character of the weak in conscience to try to reach them. That's what he has in view back in chapter 9 when he says in 9:22, to the weak, I became weak that I might win the weak. That's his point. Now, let's get into our next question. Number 18, Paul says that the saint should eat. That's your next blank on number 18. The saint should eat anything sold in the meat market without asking questions. He says it twice. Verse 25, verse 27. He says twice, eat the meat without asking questions. Now, asking questions would have been natural, I think, for a Jew or a sincere believer. Has this been offered in the meat to the pagans? Has this been offered to idols? That would be a Jewish question. That'd be natural for a former pagan then who thinks maybe we ought to abstain from some of this. It would be natural for them to ask questions. Paul is explicit. Do not ask questions. And isn't it interesting that it could be the case that one would like to take this a bit too far and police brethren on the matter? You start asking questions. You act like you get to be the dictator on everybody else's liberty. I asked them about it. Stop asking questions. Stop prodding. Stop acting as if you're the arbiter on who decides what is and what isn't. Paul simply says, if you've got the meat offered before you, eat the meat. Don't ask questions where it came from. Just eat the meat. Oh, and by the way, he had said in verse 26, oh, and by the way, everything belongs to God anyway. And that's your next blank on number 19. Paul quotes Psalm 24 to say that God's universal lordship has now been recognized in Jesus. The food laws, hang it up. Hang it up, Paul says. Just know this. Everything belongs to God in Christ anyway. All right, number 20. The anyone, verse 28. My translation says, but if anyone says to you, and this raises a question, who is the anyone? Who is the anyone? Is it a saint? Or is it a pagan? Think about the difference there. Look at 10:28. You might even pause the video if you're that interested. 10:28. Who is the anyone? How would it read on 10:28 if it were a saint? If a fellow saint says to you, this is meat sacrificed to idols, do not eat it, Paul says, for the sake of the one who informed you and for conscience sake. Or is it a pagan? If anyone, a pagan fellow says to you, this is meat offered to idols, don't eat it for the sake of the one who informed you and for conscience sake. Are you being cautious about a fellow saint's proclivity against the meat offered to idols? Is it perhaps a pagan, a non-Christian, who's announcing this is meat offered to idols? And is Paul saying, well, for his conscience, he may think that that's a hang-up. Don't eat the meat offered to idols because it could send the wrong message to a non-Christian. Which one? Or is it both? Either one, a Christian or a non-Christian. Probably that. Look at 10:32. Give no offense either to Jews or Gentiles. And those are both non-Christian parties that he has in view. How do we know that? 10:32, or to the church of God. 10:32, don't offend the Jews, the Greeks, those are non-Christian parties, or the Christian party, the church of God. He says in any case, back up to 10:28 now, look back at 10:28. If anyone says to you, Jewish non-Christian, Gentile non-Christian, fellow saint, anybody says to you this is meat sacrificed to idols, they're announcing it, Paul says do not eat it. Why? For the sake of the informant. If a fellow announces it in a way as to say, I don't know that you ought to be eating this. This is meat that's been offered to idols. Obviously, he's saying that for a reason. Why would he announce that? Think about that. Why would he announce this meat's been offered to idols? Obviously, he has some kind of connection mentally. He's connecting the connection with the meat offered to idols. He's making a connection that somehow this would endorse paganism, idolatry. Whether he's a Christian or non-Christian is irrelevant. He somehow has made this mental connection. And you can hear by the fact that he's saying that he thinks this is an issue. Whether it is or not is another matter. Paul says he thinks it's an issue. And because he's announced it, he's informed it. Do not eat it for the conscience sake. 10:28. Paul has already been clear enough to say you have the right to eat the meat offered to idols. So when he gets to 10:28 and he says don't eat it for conscience sake, he's not talking about you, the one who might eat. He is talking about the other fellow, the informant. And he clears that up in 10:29. I mean not your own conscience, but the other man's, the one who informed you. You're thinking about him. He obviously made that remark for some reason. And so he says, for why is my freedom judged by another's conscience? Now, at this point, we need to raise a question about the conscience, but let's get the blank on number 20 first. The anyone might be the pagan host. Number 20, a fellow, here's your blank, saint, or anybody, verse 32. And I think verse 32 supports that. It is probably, specifically and primarily, a Christian saint, a saint with a weak conscience. But Paul sees this as even broader. Primarily, it focuses on the Christian division at Corinth, I think. Some Christians are saying you can, some are saying you can't in regard to eating the meat offered to idols. Paul specifically has that in view, but I think it's even a broader truth. And he makes that clear, I think, on verse 32. Now, let's get the blank on 21. 21, Paul says that the problem exists in the, where does the problem exist? In the weak, here are your blanks, in the weak conscience of the fellow man, probably primarily and specifically a Christian man. Fellow Christian who thinks in his weak conscience, you can't eat the meat offered to idols. Paul says that's where the problem exists. Let me get a drink of coffee, and we'll come back to that. The conscience, then, what is it? Let's be clear first and foremost about what the conscience is not. Man's conscience is not the standard. What is the conscience then? The conscience is an individual's judgment of the standard. Let that sink in. The conscience, your conscience, you may have a thing that says tattoos are a sin. If your conscience sends you that way, that is your assessment of the standard. But it's not the standard. Your decision on tattoos is not the standard, but you're making an assessment of what you deem to be a standard. So if you've got a brother who deems his conscience tells him it's a sin to eat the meat offered to idols, he's making a judgment on the standard. And that's what the conscience is. It is a judgment on the standard, but it is not the standard itself. So look at 10:29. Paul says, why is my freedom judged by another man's conscience? The problem is the weak conscience. Now, here's the thing. Real love limits, it restricts our freedom. But Paul says you don't get to come along, and because you've got a conscience issue, you've got an opinion, you've got some kind of proclivity on something, you don't get to now hold everybody else to your standard. That's exactly what 10:29 is saying you do not get to do. You do not get to make your conscience the standard for everybody else. People still have liberties or rights, not to be loveless or selfish, but they have the right to eat the meat offered to idols. And Paul says you don't have this conscience issue that now gets to set the standard for everybody else. So now on 10:30, if I partake, he says, with thankfulness, that is to say, if I have the right attitude and I've been aware and I've been thoughtful and I'm loving towards my brethren, if I have that attitude, why am I to be slandered concerning that which I give thanks for and I have liberty regarding? Paul says that the conscience doesn't set the standard. Now watch this. It doesn't become the standard. I'm on number 21 in the workbook. It is the mind's judgment of the standard. Love limits one's freedom. It does not transform conscience into law, Too many variables to give a one-size-fits-all directive on how to approach these issues specifically. And so there is flexibility. We ought to have love at the background, and love will take care of all of this. And the two problems that come out here are, number one, weak consciences, and the weak conscience is the problem of the weak, the have-nots. The problem on those who have is the attitude of lovelessness. Going back to the start of this unit in chapter 8, we know that all have knowledge. Knowledge makes arrogant. Love edifies. If you have legitimate love for brethren, these issues will fall into place rightly. Thermostats won't be a problem where love exists. It's how it is. It's how it is. You get love right, you won't have the problem with the thermostat, folks. It's that simple. 69 is not a problem. 71 is not a problem. 70, meeting in the middle, is not a problem. It's not a problem when love is our directive. Now take a look at this. Here's our last little bit. Paul has to sum all of this up. 10:31. Whether then, here's his whole summation of the whole thing. Whatever you do, eat, drink, whatever you do, all to the glory of God. What's their slogan been? What's Corinth's slogan been? All things are lawful. 6:12, 10:23. 4 times Paul reiterates their little slogan. They would have had t-shirts made up, hats, political badges, and you know what they would all said? All things are lawful. That's Corinth's strong party. Strong party. I'm saying that tongue in cheek. The strong party would have said, all things are lawful. All things are lawful. That's their slogan. That's their mantra. Paul gives an alternative slogan, an alternative thing that you would have put on a hat or a shirt or a badge. And it says, all to the glory of God. And when we buy into that slogan, that mantra, all to the glory of God, this business about seeking our own first, not our neighbor, not the good of the community, the church, people in general, when we get all to the glory of God right, it's going to take us further than we ever thought we'd go. We'll like NASCAR. We'll sit there and eat the meat offered to idols with those who know that you can. We'll abstain from it with those who can't. Love will shape us into being, we're not chameleons. Chameleons would suggest some kind of political, like we're politicians, like we just get along with anybody and everybody just to engender votes. That's not what we're doing, folks. It's actually for the good of people. We are getting along with people for the sake of souls. There is a difference between being a political hack, being a chameleon where we waffle, and having something that doesn't waffle, it doesn't move, it doesn't crawfish, and that is the gospel that we've bought into. And because the gospel is unmovable, we do move in relation to people. We do move in relation to variables or circumstances or events, but we don't let the gospel, the unalterable, unfeigned, pure, unadulterated gospel move. We don't let it move, but it directs us where we do move in relation to people and circumstances and variables and events. So on 10:31, Paul gives a counter slogan, all to the glory of God. All things are lawful, all to the glory of God, Paul says. Verse 32, give no offense either to Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God. That's his conclusion. We're trying to be loving. Do not do something. That word offense is not, don't make them upset. That's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about making people upset, folks. Back to chapter 8. He is talking about an issue that legitimately causes loss of life with Christ. Your brother, your weak brother, is ruined, destroyed. Verse 11 says, this is not some proclivity that he's talking about. If your brethren just like the thermostat on 71, tell them to take a hike if they need to be told it because they're causing division over something as petty as a thermostat. But if it's going to actually drive them out of church and out of life with Christ, Paul says, then do not offend, do not cause them to sin or stumble is the word there. Whether it's Jew, Gentile, the church of God, doesn't matter. Christian, non-Christian, do what you can for the sake of saving souls. Verse 33, Paul has already argued his case about his liberties and how he relinquishes liberties. Verse 33, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, so that they may be saved. That's our directive. That's our goal. Our big goal has to be not our own personal liberties, but the salvation of people. And then the final remark, here's an unfortunate chapter division. Chapter 11, verse 1 should have been chapter 10, verse 34. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. That's the kind of thing that Paul's been going for. Back to 9:22 and 23. All things to all men that we might save some. He is still in chapter 8, chapter 9, and still in chapter 10. He is in the same issue. Liberties. Just because you have a liberty doesn't give you the right to use it lovelessly. You have the right to use your liberty. You don't have the right to be loveless or selfish. All right, so fill in these blanks on number 22. His fourfold conclusion is this. He said all it needs to say. Summing it up now. 22a. Do all to the glory of God. That counters Corinth's slogan or remark. All things are lawful. 22b. No offense to anyone. That's do not cause them to sin is what he says. Be aware, be thoughtful, be loving. Do not cause them to sin. 22c. Please all men so that they might be saved. Salvation of a human being is more important than eating a nice cheeseburger that was cheap because you got it sold in the meat market. All might be saved. Please all men so that they all might be saved. And then your next blank on 22c, love does not seek its own profit. Oh, no, it doesn't. 1 Corinthians 13, this grand chapter on love, which is actually in the middle of this discussion on the spiritual gifts. 13:5, love does not seek its own. What if we applied that to our marriages, our parenting, our relationships with our colleagues and our friends? Love does not seek its own. Love seeks the neighbor's good more. 1 Corinthians 10:24, Romans chapter 12 and verse 14, Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3. Love seeks not its own. And then 22d, imitate Paul as he imitates Christ. What's his point? Be a loving, selfless, sacrificial servant. And model that not only in the meat issues, but in all of these other issues that might bear similarity. Be like Paul, be like Christ, who was the form of a servant, gave self up for the big picture, saving souls, not causing people to lose life with Christ, and keeping at the fore our need to glorify God. That brings us to the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and chapter 11, verse 1. Okay, I'm going to actually stop the video here at 42 minutes, and we'll do another video where we start up on 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, starting with the veil issue. Okay.